Hello, my name is Devin Dashel. I'm a PhD candidate in Microbial Food Safety and Spoilage Lab at Cornell University, and today I'll be presenting the module Moving Towards FSMA 204 Traceability Compliance, a produce processor case example. So a brief overview of this presentation. In the first part, we'll do some background and review on what FSMA 204 actually is and the Food Traceability Rule. And then in the second part, we'll be going over how to conduct a traceability gap analysis. And we'll be using a bagged salad product as a case example. And this will also be based off an experience I had working with a real produce processor that was trying to get their operations into compliance with FSMA 204. And we helped consult for them on their bagged salad product and actually did a traceability gap analysis with them. So part one, this is the who, what, where, when, and why of FSMA 204. So what is FSMA 204? Well, it's a Food Safety Modernization Act stipulation. Essentially, the FDA came out with a final rule on the requirements for additional traceability records for certain foods, otherwise known as the Food Traceability Final Rule. And essentially what this does in a nutshell is establishes traceability record-keeping requirements. So basically, more documentation and more data needs to be kept at certain stages of the supply chain for select products to enhance the traceability. And importantly, records must be maintained and provided to the FDA. And if they do come to your facility and ask for your traceability records, they need to be provided within 24 hours on an electronic sortable spreadsheet. So the why, well, essentially the whole idea is to improve food safety. Basically, the FDA did an analysis of a bunch of different food products and identified the ones that would be best suited for more traceability records to help improve food safety. The idea is that if there is an outbreak and there's a contaminated product on the market, then increased traceability will allow FDA to identify the source of contamination faster and get it off the market and basically make a safer food supply for all of us. So basically, speed is the name of the game for this in what FSMA 204 is trying to achieve. So when FSMA 204 is already the law, the FDA gave a grace period to stakeholders until January 2026 to allow the industry to get into compliance, but routine inspections will begin in 2027. And who? Well, it actually is everyone in the supply chain for foods that require these enhanced traceability measures. Basically, anyone who's storing or packing, harvesting, processing any food that's on the food traceability list, which we'll get to in a second, they must keep these traceability records, so no one is exempt. So a little bit of background, the food traceability list is a list of these foods that the FDA came up with. You can see some of them here on the right, vegetables, different fruits, some cheeses. And this list is expected to expand in the future. So you can find this list on the FDA's website and check if your products are in the food traceability list, and if they are, then the increased record keeping will apply to you. And be sure to check if any exemptions may apply to your product. Not all vegetables and not all cheeses are on the food traceability list, so you'll want to double check that. So the critical tracking events and key data elements are really the meat of the food traceability rule. So these essentially lay out when you need to keep these traceability records and what the traceability records are. So the critical tracking events, or CTEs, are basically steps in the supply chain for a food product on the food traceability list that require the records to be kept. So there will be some examples of these on the next slide. And the key data elements are basically the records that you need to keep for each critical tracking event. So basically you have your foods on the food traceability list. Any critical tracking event that occurs when you're handling that food, you must keep these key data elements. And there are numerous key data elements for each critical tracking event. And these elements will need to be in the spreadsheet that you produce to FDA should they inquire within 24 hours. So here are the critical tracking events. And of course, you can get more information on these and get the exact definitions of what constitutes each one of these CTEs from the FDA's website. But there is harvesting, cooling, initial packing, first land-based receiver, which applies to seafood, shipping and receiving, so whenever you're sending out the product or you're getting it in as a raw material, as well as transformation. So if you do anything to a product on the food traceability list that transforms it in some way, that also constitutes a critical tracking event. And here's another example. So we have a supply chain here: the farm, harvester, cooler, the initial packer, the produce processor, a distributor, and the retail food establishment. And you can see the different critical tracking events that apply in each step of the supply chain. So the harvester, obviously harvesting is a critical tracking event that would apply to them. And so they are responsible to keep those harvesting key data elements, as well as the first person that would cool any produce that was freshly harvested. And the initial packer has initial packing key data elements, shipping key data elements, and the processor, when they receive the raw material from the packer, they have receiving key data elements that they need to keep. And then when they ship it further down the line, they have shipping key data elements they need to keep. And the produce processor, in this case, also has transformation key data elements that they need to keep. So if they get a raw material and they do some process, they cut it up or they slice it or they mix it together with something else, that's a transformation event, and they'll need to keep key data elements for that as well. One very important key data element is the traceability lot code. This is basically the meat of FSMA 204. This code is what FDA envisions as allowing them to trace back and forth through the supply chain and see all the key data elements that are associated with the product based on its traceability lot code. And essentially how it works is who has to assign a traceability lot code to a food depends on what step of the supply chain you're in. Sometimes you'll receive a food that already has a traceability lot code. Other times you'll have to be the one who assigns it. But essentially, you'll be responsible for defining the traceability lot, how much product you want in one lot that's traceable under the same code. And then you will apply that traceability lot code to the lot, which can be any number of different coding schemes. There isn't one that you need to choose. There's some examples here on the right. And how much product you actually include in one lot will also be up to your discretion as well. But of course, there's the trade-off that if you make your traceability lot too big and there is a recall, then you would have more product affected by that recall. And importantly, the traceability lot code is maintained throughout the whole supply chain, so it'll be the same unless there's a transformation step. Then the traceability lot code can change. But essentially, all the key data elements from all the critical tracking events can be connected to this traceability lot code. So someone looking at this code would be able to see the key data elements for any transformation events that happen to that product, and for the key data elements from where it was harvested, for example, or where it was initially cooled. And finally, we have the traceability plan. This essentially is for your operation. If you are subject to FSMA 204 and you're working with a food that is in the food traceability list, you will need a traceability plan. And this is essentially just a summary document where you will write out how you're going to actually identify the foods on the food traceability list that you manufacture, process, pack, or hold. You should have a method for doing that and have that written out in the traceability plan. And also your method for maintaining records required under the Food Traceability Rule, whether those will be on paper or electronic, or if you'll be using some sort of software. And then finally, how you'll assign your traceability lot codes. So if you have a lot of food that is on the food traceability list, such as some sort of fresh produce, you'll want to have a scheme for how much is going to constitute one lot, what type of code you're going to use as a traceability lot code, etc. So now moving on to part 2. Here we'll be conducting a traceability gap analysis. And so we'll be doing a case example of a bagged salad mix. So in moving towards getting your operation FSMA 204 compliant, doing a traceability gap analysis is a great first step. And the key points in the traceability gap analysis are: 1, to identify all products that your operation works with that are subject to the Food Traceability Rule. 2, identify the critical tracking events that you do with that product. And 3, look up the key data elements that you'll be responsible for managing for each of those critical tracking events. And 4, you'll want to conduct a mock traceback. So basically this is to test, can you get all the info that you need in 24 hours? Can you get the key data elements for that product that you're doing a mock traceback for within the given time period that FDA requires, that being 24 hours. And 5, after doing that mock traceback, look at which key data elements you currently capture and which ones you're missing. And then that'll basically be your roadmap for the gaps that you need to fill in your operation. So step 1, identifying your product subject to the Food Traceability Rule. This one isn't too bad. You can go onto the FDA's website, look up the current food traceability list, and you will find a whole list of foods, some examples on the right here. You'll want to pay special attention to the exemptions. Not every cheese, not every vegetable is covered under the Food Traceability Rule, so you'll want to be crystal clear on which of your products actually fall on this list. So in our case, for the case example we were working with, we looked at a processor that was making a bagged salad mix. And this did fall in the food traceability list. Fresh cut leafy greens and a bagged salad mix like this one are definitely on the food traceability list, so this product needs to be traceable. And this one also represented a bit of a more complex example because it had multiple different ingredients in it from products that were all on the food traceability list, different types of greens and carrots, etc. So your next step will be identifying the critical tracking events associated with the product. So a great place to start here is your process flow diagram for a product. So basically look at all of the manufacturing steps that you should already have written out for the product and compare that with the list of critical tracking events and figure out which ones are associated with your product. So in this example, on the left here, you can see the process flow steps for a bagged lettuce product, slightly abbreviated, but basically raw material receiving, storage in a warehouse, then it gets put on the production line and cut with cutting machines, goes through a flume wash, shaker, dryer, then it gets bagged, sealed, put in the metal detector, transferred to warehousing, and later it gets shipped out. So looking on the right at our critical tracking events, we have harvesting, cooling, initial packing, first land-based receiver, shipping, receiving, transformation, and again, you can get more info on these from the FDA's website. But looking at these and comparing it to our process flow diagram, we've identified 3 critical tracking events that would be associated with this bagged salad product. Those being receiving, so the raw materials that are coming in that we plan to use in the bagged lettuce, that is a critical tracking event. So we'll need to keep key data elements when we receive that produce. Next is transformation. So this would be the cutting machines. All the different raw materials get cut up, and that constitutes a transformation event. We now have a salad mix of a bunch of cut up greens that have been mixed together in one bag. So we'll need to keep key data elements at that point as well. And then finally, shipping. When we distribute this bagged solid product, we will have key data elements at that phase as well. So in the next step, we want to identify what the key data elements we need to keep actually are for the different critical tracking events. So for receiving, I've put a list here of the different key data elements associated with this critical tracking event. And again, you can find this on the FDA's website. But essentially, we'll need 1, a traceability lot code for the food. And at this stage, we're assuming that the traceability lot code will actually be coming from the supplier or whoever was the first one to harvest and initially pack the food. If the raw materials coming in have already been packed, then there should be a traceability lot code coming in from the supplier. And a lot of these are things that should already be in your databases, and you won't probably have to make an effort to get this information because you'll already have it. Things like the quantity and unit measure of the food, a product description for the food, the date you received the food, stuff like that. But the number 4 here, this key data element, this one is critical and may not be provided by a lot of suppliers. Currently, this is the location description for the immediate previous source of the food. So essentially, you'll need the location of the farm and field that this product came from, in this case, lettuce. And that will have to be supplied to you from the supplier. And that is a very key data element that you'll need to keep track of. And number 6 here is the location description for the traceability lot code source, or the traceability lot code source reference. Basically, that just refers to the location where the first traceability code was assigned. So whoever the supplier was in this case would be the ones that assigned the traceability lot code, and the source would be the location that they did that at. And finally, just some logistical things such as a reference document type and reference document number, which should, in most cases, already be set up within your internal scheme in your organization. So for the gap analysis that we conducted for this bagged salad product, we did actually find some areas where the key data elements were not actually all there. So the quantity and unit measure of the food and product description, those were all there, date we received the food, but there was no traceability lot code coming in for these bagged salad products. And that was just a result of these suppliers that the produce processor was purchasing from hadn't yet gotten their traceability lot codes assigned, as well as in many cases the location description for where the food came from was missing. So sometimes it would be there, the farm in the fields, it could be that granular, but for a lot of times food coming in from a broker, that information wasn't necessarily there. So that was a missing key data element. Next, for transformation. So in this case, this is one of the ones where you will actually have to assign a new traceability lot code for the food. So in this example, we have multiple different ingredients coming in for the bagged salad product. Each one of those has their own traceability lot code. Once those all get cut up and mixed together, then the product is now its own new traceability lot. So this new product that has been formed will be assigned its own traceability lot code by the processor. And that traceability lot code should be connected to the previous traceability lot codes of the products that were used as ingredients. That way the traceability chain does not get broken. And in our gap analysis that we conducted, we found that the produce processor we were working with was not currently generating new traceability lots for foods after they were being transformed. So this was a gap in key data elements that they needed to fix. Finally, shipping. At this stage, it's a lot of the same information we're already familiar with. So the traceability lot code for the food that's being shipped out, quantity, description, location description for whoever the immediate subsequent recipient is, the location for the description from which you shipped the food, date, more location descriptions, and internal document reference numbers. And in the case example that we did, we again found that they did not supply a traceability lot code for the food when they were sending it out to their distributors, and accordingly there was no traceability lot code source. So basically one of the main issues at this produce processor was that they had not come up with a scheme to define traceability lots and add traceability lot codes. So this was the major gap in their key data elements that we discovered. So finally, in doing a mock traceback, you'll want to see how many records you can get and in what time frame. So basically, run through your current traceback procedures and determine what info you could obtain. Were there any KDEs that were not currently accounted for, such as in the example that we just went through? And another important process, or consideration rather, is how long did it take for the records to be obtained? So for the produce processor that we were working with, in many cases, the supplier information for where the raw ingredients came from, the farm and field, wasn't immediately there, but it could be discovered through some digging. So that pointed to a lapse in their internal record keeping system. The fact that that information existed but wasn't immediately populated into the software system they were using during a mock traceback, that was definitely a gap revealed in doing this traceback. And so it's at this stage that you'll also want to consider what system your business is using to capture and maintain records, and if it's working for you, and if you'll need to potentially switch to electronic to get those records out in time. And finally, considering how your data is shared between you and suppliers. Are the suppliers you're working with aware of the FSMA 204 requirements, and did they have a plan to get in compliance as well? So the major findings from our gap analysis working with this produce processor was that a lot of the location information from suppliers was lacking. So we are currently in this grace period, so FSMA 204 traceability rule is not being enforced, but it will be enforced soon. So it's very important to open this dialogue with suppliers, brokers, whoever you're sourcing your raw ingredients from. If they don't currently have a traceability scheme, you'll basically need to work with them and say, hey, you need to get in compliance with this. I have receiving key data elements that I am responsible for, and if you can't provide those to me, then we likely can't use you as a supplier going forward. So those suppliers also didn't provide traceability lot codes, so not only were there gaps in simply the information of where the produce was coming from, field and farm, but also no effort was being made to define a traceability lot. So the biggest action items for the processor that we worked with were to, one, establish this dialogue with suppliers, ensure that they are getting the correct key data elements from them, since they themselves will be responsible for a lot of that information when they purchase the foods. And two, they needed to develop a traceability lot scheme and traceability lot codes within their own process. So currently they had no definition, working definition for how much food would constitute a traceability lot, and how the codes were going to be assigned and how those records were going to be kept in their system. So in conclusion, you'll want to determine what products you must keep traceability records for by carefully consulting the food traceability list and looking for exemptions, and identifying the associated critical tracking events and key data elements. You'll need to perform a gap analysis and a mock traceback to help you determine which information you don't currently capture or that isn't currently captured by your suppliers. And then start that dialogue with suppliers and internally to ensure that correct information is captured in the future, and it can be done so promptly within a 24-hour time window that the FDA requires. And with that, I would thank you for listening to this traceability module, and I hope you found it helpful.